Analysia, and thanks for everyone for attending. Now that we've heard about NIH, we're gonna sort of shift gears completely and talk about the Department of Defense, specifically the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. And this is the second. I'm going to share my slides real quick. Uh, Perfect. All right. Can everyone see those? Um, so this is actually the second in two presentations that we're giving. The first one was last week and focused on cancer-related programs within the congressionally directed programs. This week is going to focus on brain and neurodegenerative programs within the congressional programs. A lot of what I'll discuss is going to be somewhat repetitive from last week in terms of just sort of the general tips and tricks for navigating the congressionally directed programs, making applications, but obviously a lot of the key information on the targets of those programs will be new this week. Um, and actually, the newest place I'll start off for folks who may have been in attendance last week is news that actually just came out yesterday. So and this is really important and really sets the stage well. And I added this slide about 10 minutes ago, so you can see how new this information is. But this is really critical for this discussion. And I'll talk more about this throughout. But the reason is, and you can see this at the very bottom, this new package, which is put forward by the House and is a minibus package that is focused on the Department of Defense, the Labor HHS bill, and a couple other bills, um, would avoid significant cuts at most agencies. And this is really important because for a couple reasons. One, this is Congress pushing back a little bit on the information that the White House put out with regard to what their recommended budget is. Two, this is a sort of a reversal from some of the cuts that were experienced last year, specifically in the CDMRP. And really three, I'm sure all of you have been keeping track of this, and there have been discussion about cuts at NIH. And this represents sort of a full funded recommendation for the NIH. Now, it's worth noting that this is still a House bill. It's supposed to go to the Senate this weekend, or I believe early next week. The Senate could do a number of things. They could sign it as is. They could make changes and send it back to the House. They could say, we don't like this at all. As you can see from the headline here, it's looking good in terms of passing. And this has significant ramifications for the CDMRP programs that we're about to talk about. So without further ado, I'll jump into the meat of the program here, and then we'll talk more about this sort of throughout. So really, why does the military engage in medical research? And the obvious thing is, when there are specific solutions that are needed to address warfighter health, with regard to performance, treatment in austere and operational spaces, and return to duty. And there also might be solutions that are specifically needed for the military health system. And finally, when they're just told to do so by Congress. And sometimes this comes with or without appropriations. Um, Without appropriations could mean Congress wants information on, what the Department of Defense has been doing in the area of, you name it, traumatic brain injury, burns, combat casualty care, cancer, neurodegenerative diseases. Other times, there are specific programs that come with congressional language and intent, and I'll explain later why that's important, that come with appropriations for targeted programs in any or all or more of the programs that I just alluded to. The other reason is it's not always well known that the military health system is one of America's largest healthcare institutions. So you sort of have this conceptual idea that there are service members that are deployed or even stationed here in the United States that require and need medical care, of which is covered through this TRICARE agency. And that sort of equates to around 1.5 million people, but there are also these almost 10 million beneficiaries that are eligible for care within the military health system. And this is critically important because their range of ages, ailments, and needs is consistent, more consistent, I would say, with the general population than maybe with the sort of sub portion of military service members who require care. In the sense that you have pediatrics, you have live births, obstetrics, you have teenagers transitioning to adulthood. You have retirees who are, who are much older, and everywhere in between. So it's a really representative population, and obviously the military health system is responsible for caring for these patients. So their goal is to fund research that will provide the best possible care, not just for active duty service members, but for all these beneficiaries as well. And part of the way they do this is through this CDMRP, which, as I sort of alluded to previously, is the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs. So it's worth sort of a brief history lesson on CDMRP and what it is. And it's interesting because it actually originated in 1992 through a program focused around breast cancer. And there were a group of lobbyists that really thought that the NIH was not doing as much as it should be doing, specifically in the translational and clinical space regarding breast cancer. So this group lobbied Congress and argued that the DoD, by nature of the way that it funds research, which is really always geared toward translation and clinical application. And I'll talk again more about that later, but thought that there could be an additional pot of funding executed by the federal government, the Department of Defense in this particular case, that would support breast cancer research that would be more applied and more translational and more clinical. And this was actually the first program that was stood up by the congressionally directed programs in 1993. And then since then, it has ballooned into what in a normal year is usually a $1.5 billion per year program, which I understand is significantly lower than sort of the operating budget for NIH. But you also have to remember that you sort of have a subset of focused programs here that are a little bit more focused on translational and clinical research. They do support basic and foundational research as well, but that $1.5 billion, again, in a normal year, can really make a significant impact on these respective indications. So the next thing that's worth sort of noting is how the money travels down to these different programs. And as I started from the very beginning, we have Congress and the National Defense Authorization Act, which basically defines these appropriations. And then we have the appropriation bill, which actually releases the funds for these funds. And that trickles down through the Secretary of Defense to the Defense Health Agency, and that agency is where these congressionally directed programs actually reside. There is another side of the coin that the Defense Health Agency sponsors, and it's a set of core funding that is focused on research and development. And this is actually important because even though the research that program funds are more military specific, there is a little bit of overlap in some of these programs. So, for example, the congressionally directed programs has a program specifically focused on traumatic brain injury. And obviously, the core funded enterprise on the left side of your slide is critically interested in traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder and other brain injury types of issues as well. So those things are not mutually exclusive, and they communicate very closely and make an effort as to not overlap and leverage each other's programs. And they have a number of overlapping sort of advisors as well. So these things are important to know, even though we're focused on the right-hand side of this slide. The left-hand side of the slide is important also. This just gives a little bit more granularity on some of these core programs within the science and technology portfolio, as well as what the CDMRP is. Specifically, the CDMRP traditionally has had about 35 directed programs. Um, as I mentioned, in 2025, with the full year continuing resolution, there was a significant cut to CDMRP to the tune of around 60%, and they only funded a small portion of these programs. And we're happy to say that, at least on paper, currently, a lot of these programs are meant to return in 2026. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. But the way that CDMRP traditionally breaks up its programs are, and I sort of mentioned this already, is you have these sort of military specific programs, which are involve combat readiness and military burn and orthopedics. And defining your research in terms of the impact that it's going to be provided to the military and the active duty service member population specifically is critically important in these programs. On the other side of the coin, they have these national programs, which are really beneficial not just to service members, but also to their beneficiaries and to the US population at large. So there's less of this burden to sort of be restrictive to demonstrating the impact of the research only to warfighters. And that works out really well for especially for faculty who are used to primarily working within NIH. There isn't a huge leap from what you might be familiar with on a day-to-day basis to applying to some of these congressionally directed programs, which are focused on, again, national interests. So I mentioned that there have been significant changes just in the past day. I was not able to fully update this slide for some of the programs that you see that are blank and actually may have received funding. So, for example, starting off with the alcohol and abuse and the bone marrow failure are going to be theoretically receiving funding in FY26, but what are highlighted are all the sort of neuro-specific programs. So you can see a fairly robust set of programs ranging from, the autism program, which is funded at $8 million, to the peer-reviewed medical program, which is funded at $370 million. And really the reason for that large amount of funding is because that program is just a huge catch-all of funding of topic areas. And I'll talk about that momentarily, but you can see there's a fairly robust list of indication-specific interests here across the CDMRP. One thing that I did have highlighted, and maybe somewhat confusing, but I'll explain it, is the toxic exposures program. And the reason for that is because there are some focus areas within that program that are dedicated to neurotoxins, both preventing the effects of neurotoxins and treating the effects of neurotoxins, and other sort of long-term ramifications of military service and exposures and the implications of that on the brain. So I kept that one in because there could be faculty who might be interested in exploring that particular program. So I just sort of alluded to the fact that CDMRP, for the most part, is interested in translational and clinical research. But you can see from this diagram that most of their funding mechanisms sort of still reside in the preclinical space. That being said, the sort of catch-22 or balancing act that CDMRP is trying to achieve is that most programs do offer some type of clinical trial award. That may be a full-scale clinical trial, that might be a pilot clinical trial, first in human, things like that. And they balance that with earlier stage research, but that earlier stage research is still meant to infer what the translational pathway might be. So even for something like a discovery award, where you are where typically no preliminary data is required, and you're really trying to make a discovery that's going to move you in a direction, the application really requires that you think about what direction that could move in toward a clinical application. and just sort of think about how your discovery, if successful, could alter the standard of care, how it might affect patients. And again, this could be years from now. But again, one of the requirements of DoD proposal writing, and we'll talk about this later, is even for early stage research applications, really thinking forward to how it might be applicable for clinical patients. Um, just to give you an idea of some of the mechanisms for each of these programs, and again, you can see a lot of them were not offered in FY25, so that's a really positive um, indication that some of them are coming back. Some of these are going to be repetitive with each other, even though they have different names. So you can see, for example, in the peer-reviewed medical program, you have the Technology Therapeutic Development Award, where in ALS, you also have a Therapeutic Development Award of a slightly different name. And then in the Toxic Exposures program, you have a Translational Research Partnership Award, also maybe a slightly different name. Most of these are trying to accomplish the same thing. If you sort of you think along the research spectrum of, foundational research, preclinical, I know I'm sort of bucketizing this into large buckets, but foundational research, applied research, translational research, and clinical research. Um, so those are sort of the four main buckets. There are going to be nuances in all of these, and uh, as I'll talk about later, one of the key aspects of applying to CDMRP is really closely reading these program announcements because and each of these different mechanisms and trying to understand where your research idea fits best. Because one, that's the way CDMRP communicates, and two, it could require some flexibility in terms of what mechanisms are available in a given year. So, for example, in the peer-reviewed medical program last year, because it was so restrictive in the amount of funds that it received, they only had two mechanisms available, where they typically have like five or six different mechanisms available. So things can change from year to year. And it's worth really when these start to come out, closely noting the different mechanisms that are available, what type of research they're looking for, the requirements for preliminary data, and how your research fits into all of those requirements. One other thing I do want to talk about specifically, and I mentioned this before, was the peer-reviewed medical program and how it sort of acts as a catch-all for a lot of different focus areas. And it is $370 million, at least proposed, which is a large amount of funding. And you can see here, I've highlighted all the programs that align to neurodegenerative disease or brain health or illness. The yellow ones are ones that were available last year, and the orange ones are new. So there are a couple new programs that are actually going to be available this year. Along with this, you can see all of the unhighlighted topic areas that are very broad ranging, from things like food allergies to Fragile X syndrome to orthotics and prosthetics to tuberculosis. So really, this is the way that this list comes together is in a couple of different ways. It can be uh, Congress people who maybe are dealing with these illnesses and industries themselves in their personal lives with themselves or beneficiaries or family members or friends and are invested in trying to solve these problems. It could be from lobbying groups who are requesting and illustrating that these are key issues that need to be solved and are asking Congress to dedicate funding toward these. And this is one way that they do this. So again, these are opportunities again to look for specific funding language that aligns to your research interests. The other thing that's key in terms of applying to CDMRP programs, and again, I'll talk about this later, is aligning to program focus areas. Along with the overall program congressional definition and intent, and the individual mechanisms that are offered. Each of these mechanisms will provide focus areas of interest that you have to align to. And these are based on different things. They're based on the state of the science. They're sometimes based on military specific needs. They're based on gaps in funding from other sources. So again, some of these programmatic panels where these are being defined contain program officers from NIH. They're contributing to the autism program, the Parkinson's program, the Alzheimer's program. And the goal here is for CDMRP to be an adjunct sometimes to NIH funding, and sometimes vice versa. So really, they don't want to overlap. They want to be partners with each other. They want to leverage each other's funding. So again, you might see things that are sometimes, and you can see some examples here, sometimes very high level and vague, and other times things that are very, very specific in terms of uh, aligning your research to these focus areas. And this is something that is absolutely required as part of your proposal to CDMRP in any of these programs. There are going to be portions of the proposal where you really need to focus on this and really explain how your research is aligned to these needs. And again, also think about the translational aspect and how you're going to move the research, for lack of a better analogy, ball down the field in terms of getting to clinical solutions. The other thing I wanted to touch base on before I get into the specifics of an actual application are the funding rates. This is something that we get asked often. Um, and you can see here, they're a little bit all over the place. Some are somewhat on par with NIH funding rates. Some are much, much better. And a lot of this is um, uh, unfortunately dependent on a lot of different things. It's dependent on the funding that available. So you can see a program like Parkinson's, which typically only gets 10 to $15 million, obviously is a competitive landscape, and you have a lot of interest in that area. And then you have maybe something that gets a similar amount of money like epilepsy, but maybe isn't as frequently studied across the country. So now you have a significantly lower number of just general applications, resulting in a better funding rate. You have certain programs that have a triage process where they require a pre-proposal and then an invitation to a full proposal. And you can see sometimes these are very, very heavily triaged. A program like multiple sclerosis, where you have 250, over 250 pre-applications submitted and 150 accepted for full application, which again sort of contributes to that more successful funding rate where the final decision process has been adjudicated to review only the applications that theoretically have the most potential for impact, are best aligned to the focus areas, and generally results in better funding rates. I think I saw a question. The question is, for translational impact, is target discovery a viable path for early stage CDMRP mechanisms? The answer is yes. Of course, it's going to be dependent on some of the language within the focus areas of these various programs. But sometimes, and actually, let me go back a couple slides to, yeah. So you can see here, elucidate mechanisms of how exposures result in adverse effects. That could certainly be looking at discovery, develop and test approaches to never mind, sorry, develop and evaluate novel pharmacological or non-pharmacological treatments. Again, that could be target discovery in a specific indication. There may or may not be preliminary data required. There may or and also you're going to want to talk about, and this is a great transition to, talking about some of the logistics, talking about, if the discovery of certain candidates is successful, what will the following steps be like in terms of following those up for potential translation to clinical practice? Again, years away, but still thinking forward. So it's worth mentioning that, and I'll actually start with the third bullet, that programs are a year of execution. That means all of these programs that I've talked about are based on congressional appropriations, targeted congressional appropriations, and the cycle is yearly. So these programs need to wait for funding from Congress, which again, hopefully, fingers crossed, is imminent, and then they will start executing their programs for the upcoming year. Um, the other thing that's worth noting is CDMRP is an execution management agency. And what that means is they are following congressional intent and direction with how this money is meant to be spent. And that's not the only reason, but because of that reason, in the interest of fairness, quote unquote fairness, um, CDMRP does all of their communication through their website, through their program announcements, which means that unlike NIH or even some other programs within the Department of Defense, there are no program managers or program officers to speak with about specific aims pages, speak with about the alignment to the program. All of this is left for interpretation up to the investigator who is submitting. And this is a place where we can help. I'll talk about that toward the end, but don't be dismayed. This is a place where we are working with Davis closely to help make sure that you as an investigator are aligned to not just the congressional intent, but to the language within these program announcements. So I mentioned that again, that they rely on CDMRP relies on communication through the information that's provided on their website, and there actually is a tremendous amount of information and a lot of valuable information in terms of giving you the best opportunity to put your best proposal forward without being able to speak to anyone, without being able to talk to a program officer. So some of the content included is some of this information that is specific to individual programs. So you can see a lot of information is provided, historical information on what they funded in the past, the makeup of the programmatic panel, the makeup of the peer review panel, recent applications that have been funded. Um, what else? Priorities, former program announcements, and then obviously the current year's program announcement if it's available at the time, to really bring in as much information as possible so you know how to speak the language, how to relay your ideas in the context of these DoD programs. Additionally, there's webinars that are provided. And I mentioned previous funding, program announcements. And then finally, there is a subscription, so you can subscribe to specific programs of interest, and you can also self-nominate to participate as a peer reviewer. And similarly to participating in a study section at NIH, there's value in sort of seeing the behind the scenes, learning about how these operate, and that'll help you in the future in terms of making applications of your own. I talked briefly just now about culture, and I've touched on a lot of these things, but it's sort of worth reiterating that as you are designing this proposal and you find a program that meets your needs, you find a focus area that your research aligns to and a mechanism that your research aligns to, and you're telling the story of why, what you want to do and why. It's important to think about, again, not just civilians that this is going to, the civilian healthcare system that this is going to populate, but why maybe it can benefit the military health system as well. And as I mentioned before, right from the beginning, this is not maybe as much of a stretch as you might think, in the sense that there are so many beneficiaries who are treated within the system that even for rare cases and rare diseases where treatment is being received, it's important that that service member or that beneficiary or that retiree who's seeking care within the military health system is going to receive the best possible care. So as long as your ideas and your research is contributing to it, to eventually providing that best possible care, then you're in a good position. I already sort of alluded to this. You want to understand the clinical implications and the translation of your research. You want to tell the whole story. So you want to be transparent on, how you've reached this stage of your research, which is defined within the proposal, and whether that includes you're a new investigator, and that includes a very brief history of funding or no funding, independent funding, or whether you're a 30-year career researcher who's building on a bed of research and wants to apply that knowledge to a Department of Defense program. That's all really critically important to explain and be transparent on, and talk about why that is going to help you achieve the goals that you're proposing. And then again, I sort of beat a dead horse here on the impact of your research in terms of military specifics, diagnostics and treatment within the military health system, and then also long-term health and wellness, and also the applications to the population at large. So the specifics of the program of the proposal itself, there is going to be a decent amount of overlap in the proposal, specifically in um, these national programs that are relevant to the U.S. population at large. And the biggest, I'd say, nuance of these DoD programs is they proposals is they break them up into various different sections, and some of them will be information and language that is traditionally represented within, say, an R01 or an R21 or other foundational applications, but will sort of just exist in a different place within a DoD program. Some of them are going to be just sort of foreign and new, but are very, I think, sort of reasonably defined within the context of what most of you are probably familiar with. And also, it's worth noting that there are opportunities and importance of being redundant across different sections within a DoD application, and places where you should avoid redundance. But again, that's something where we can help with. But in terms of similarities, you have obviously the project narrative, which requires innovation, specific aims, most of the time preliminary data and methodology. You have supporting documents, technical and lay abstracts. Some of the differences specifically are sometimes there is this sort of relevance to military health section, again, talking about patients that are receiving care within the military health system, whether it be for, say, Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease, or there's an opportunity here to um, understand that these patients are not just treated in the civilian healthcare setting, but also in the military health system, and it's possible to make these cases. Impact statement we've talked about a lot. Transition plan we've talked about a lot. Statement of work is something that is sometimes new. It's a sort of a detailed task list that is aligned to your specific aims and your research methodology. And it is required even for foundational research, all the way up through clinical trials. So, statement of work, and there are templates provided, but statement of work is sometimes something that is new to investigators who are proposing to the DoD for the first time. And then also, regardless of the funding level you're at or mechanism level you're at, detailed budgets and budget justifications are required, even for, say, a 250K discovery award application. The review process is also slightly different. There is a traditional peer review panel that occurs, and this is somewhat consistent with NIH study sections in the sense that they are determining absolute scientific merit. They are providing written critique and scores of individual sections as well as an overall section. Um, One of the nuances here is that along with traditional scientific experts reviewing your proposal, there will be also others who participate in these peer reviews, specifically consumer reviewers, which are typically part of the community. Sometimes they represent foundations that represent the community. And also biostatisticians often review these, and tech transfer specialists also review these. So there is a significant balancing act in how you write your proposal and the different sections of the proposal that I talked about previously, and actually how you can use these different sections to your benefit to address those different types of reviewers that are going to be reading the proposal. So again, we can talk about that later, but and individually. The second half of this is once all of the full proposals are reviewed scientifically, they move on to the programmatic review. And the programmatic review panel is the panel that is establishing the program at the very beginning of the cycle. So now it has come full cycle. The programmatic review panel has prepared the program announcement. It's gone out into the world for people to apply against and submit against. And now all of these scored proposals are coming back to the programmatic review panel, and it's their job to determine programmatic fit, alignment to the program announcement, potential impact of the research, not re-adjudicate the science completely, but they are going to pay attention significantly to those scientific scores. But there is no pay line. So theoretically, proposals that score exceptionally well scientifically can fall below the pay line, and studies that score, I'll say, not as well scientifically, they still need to be very scientifically robust, can climb above the pay line and be supported. Once the decisions are made, you will get feedback on your proposal. If you had a full proposal submitted, every full proposal is scientifically reviewed. And you'll get a summary statement that looks kind of like this, where you'll have individual summary scores as well as an overall score. Don't try to determine a mathematical formula that equates these two things because they're not related in the sense that the individual scores are those that are provided and averaged by the primary, secondary, sometimes tertiary reviewers of the study section. And then the average score is voted on by the entire study section after the discussion has occurred. So, and really based on that discussion and based on sometimes unscored criteria within your proposal, these sort of average sectional scores and that average overall score might not really equate to each other. I've seen summary statements where the average scores are not as great, and the resultant overall score is very high, depending on the discussion, and vice versa, where the average section scores are very robust, and then for whatever reason, part of the discussion, hopefully, which is represented in the summary statement you get back, so you can address it, is the overall score. It can go down a little bit, but um, it's also worth noting, I'm sort of going in reverse order for this slide, but at the top, it's also worth mentioning that you can submit multiple applications to the Department of Defense at the same time. And this works especially well for investigators who have maybe platform technologies who, might be able to apply for an autism program in addition to, say, an Alzheimer's program or other neurodegenerative or any program really. So you can submit applications that have overlapping work to multiple different sources. You can't be funded for the same work twice, but absolutely, if you have opportunities to submit to multiple different programs, you absolutely have the ability to do that. It's worth just talking briefly about a resubmission. I know this might be not an area where a lot of you might fit currently, but again, these are yearly programs. So if you submit this year and then you get feedback, but you weren't funded and you want to submit again next year, I do encourage that because these programs are typically fairly consistent from year to year, and they are competitive. So, a resubmission is something that even though there aren't standing panels, there is the ability to, and also that because each of these are a year of execution efforts, each year is new. The program doesn't have a sort of a standalone response to reviewer comments, but you can take a portion of your narrative, and I encourage you to do this to respond to the comments that you received in the previous year and talk about changes that you've made, talking about making the science better, because for the most part, the peer review panel will likely be similar. You might get the same reviewers, um, And even if you don't, you've improved your science based on the comments of their peers, so and your peers as well. So this is always a positive thing to do. And the programmatic panel as well is going to, remember your proposal from last year. It's possible that you were on the cusp of funding last year, and now this year you sort of make it over the hump. So certainly worth resubmitting and addressing comments from previous years when you do that. And then finally, I should have done this at the very beginning, but I'll do it now. So, who we are. The Conafe Group is a DC-based federal relations firm that's been working with Davis for a little over a year now. And really, our responsibility is to help faculty navigate the federal government and engage with the federal government to look for new opportunities to diversify your portfolio. So, in everything we've talked about today, the way that we can help with that, again, having personally been with the Department of Defense for about 15 years prior to my current 4 years at Conafe. I sat in on many different programmatic panels. I read hundreds of these applications. So specifically here, we can help culturally align you to what they're looking for. We can help you with sort of the logistics of these different sections and how it's different from other funding agencies. We can talk about the focus areas within these programs and the mechanisms and how your research aligns to those. And then even outside of the congressionally directed programs that we've talked about today, we can help look for, if you're interested, we can have a discussion to help look for other opportunities throughout the federal government where you might be looking to, broaden your portfolio and look for additional opportunities for funding. So with that, that's all I have in terms of slides. I'm going to stop sharing, and if there's any questions, happy to entertain them.
This is your chance to ask your question. So you can post your question in the chat box, or if you want to use the raise your hand function, and then we'll call your name so you can ask your question to Eric.
I think also, if you don't mind, honestly, it's also worth maybe mentioning how to get in touch with us if you want to have a one-on-one.
Great. So our team at the Office of Research is happy to help you connect with Eric's team. We usually start with a 30-minute consultation to get everyone oriented and familiar with who we are and the research that you're doing. And to do that, you can just send us an email to conafe@ucdavis.edu, and someone from my team will get back to you and help you schedule that initial kickoff. And then once you schedule that, you can just talk to Eric whenever you want. We don't need to be involved. Dan has his hand up. Please go ahead, Dan.
Hi, thanks for that chat. I think, faculty have limited amounts of time to apply for grants. So I think the question that a lot of faculty will ask is, how do we decide to spend our efforts towards these types of funds versus NIH funds, especially in this realm? Say we're working on ALS in some way.
Sure. Excellent question. So couple of answers to that. One, I would say that there is the threshold for entry, I'd say, is fairly low in the sense that there are opportunities before putting pen to paper to get an understanding of the lay of the land, understand what the program is looking for, understand what the focus areas are, and then really make a decision on how well aligned you as an investigator are to those and what your research is. So you're not trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And then if there is strong alignment, that's sort of the first hurdle to overcome to really imply that you should be making an application. Additionally, there are opportunities to, not start from scratch. Oftentimes, I would say there are, NIH applications that are either previously been reviewed, currently being reviewed, or in process that could often transition to some of these DoD CDMRP applications. And that really provides sort of a launch pad to not have to write an entire grant from scratch, and it becomes more of a amendment or a modification rather than a brand new grant application. So again, a little bit of lowering the burden. There are going to be, that being said, there are going to be cases where we have conversations with investigators who we think have just a really great opportunity to submit against one of these programs where, it will require writing a proposal. But the other thing I'll add is that oftentimes, even if you do find that you have strong alignment and are aligned to a mechanism really well, the first submission is typically a 3 to 5 page, sometimes even lower, 2 to 5 page pre-proposal, which is vetted for an invitation to a full proposal. So that burden is also obviously low. I'm not trying to diminish the importance or even the difficulty, because sometimes writing a document that short is sometimes more difficult, and adding the impact of it into that short amount of space. But in developing that document and submitting it and getting that green light for a full proposal, as I showed with some of the historical data, you do get a little better of an opportunity and a little better of a feeling that you've met that first programmatic hurdle of alignment. And it sort of boils down, just like NIH at that point, to the rigor and the strength of your scientific proposal. And now, if you sort of get to the end of the phase and you've met both of those, and there's a good opportunity for funding.
Eric, any more questions? This is your chance.
I'll send these slides out. And Lucia, remind me, I forget, did I send last week's slides?
Yes, and we
Okay.
will bundle everything together and send it out along with the recordings so that if you have colleagues that couldn't attend, you can share that, or if you want to go back and listen to any particular section in more
So
detail,
I'll
you are able
I'll
to do
ask
that.
another question since somebody else is asking.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
you said these are typically year to year programs and that there is some change from year to year. Or are they four
I
or five
lost.
year grants?
Sorry, you dropped out for a second, but I think I
Are
got the
they, yeah,
gist.
they
So,
4 or 5 year grants, or are they just
yeah.
1 year grants?
No, 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 no. Great question. So a couple things. Excellent question. It depends on the mechanism. So typically, discovery, early stage applied research grants are 18 months to 2 years. As you get into later stage applied translational grants, now we're talking usually 3 to 4 years. And then clinical trials are typically the longest a grant can typically be is proposed is 4 years. I don't want to get into the specific details of it. There's always room for opportunities for no cost extensions and things like that on the back end, but that's a bridge you cross when you get to it. Um, the other important thing to note is, because these are year to year execution dollars, they have to be obligated by the federal government and dispersed by the federal government within that funding cycle. And I say cycle because these dollars are classified as 2 year funds, which means that traditionally, um, the government tries to, so for the upcoming cycle, the FY26 cycle, they need to be out of the government by September 30th, 2027. So there's 2 years, October 1st, 2026 till September 30th, 2027 for the government to expend these funds, which means that you get all the money up front, which is nice, right? So for a 4 year grant, you get all the money up front. You still have to obviously submit quarterly reports and account for all those funds and how you're managing them. But that's a nice thing, especially in this current environment that we're in. Last thing I'll say is that the way that at least was done last year, and I think is going to happen moving forward, is the DoD expresses these programs in total costs. And as of today, that still means the negotiated rate from your university to the federal government. That could change tomorrow. There's been some congressional language floated, but as of today, we're still in sort of quote unquote normal indirect rate land. But I think going forward, they will express these in terms of total costs. The other thing that's worth noting is that you asked about timeline. Your application isn't burdened by the timeline. The timelines and the fundings are expressed as maximums. And this is really critically important because say you're proposing a first in human clinical trial for a therapeutic that you have an IDE or an IND for, or it doesn't require one of those. And you only need to do a really phase 0 clinical trial. But the clinical trial mechanism that's available is for up to $4 million, up to 4 years. Well, you don't want to ask for $4 million because you probably don't need $4 million. And you also maybe don't need 4 years. So there are opportunities within these mechanisms, and we're getting into some really specific details here, but there are opportunities within these mechanisms to ask for the money that you need and the time that you need. And this is also important because if you start thinking strategically down the line, and again, you're putting the cart a little bit before the horse, but if you're doing early or applied stage research and you can do it for, if the allotted maximum dollar amount is 250K or say 350K total cost, and you think you can do it in 12 months, you can do that. You can ask for the full amount of money for less time. So again, both the time that is evaluated or allowed and the money that is allowed are both estimated as maximums. So you can ask for less money for the whole time or the whole money for less time. So it's not sort of incrementally funded. There's a little tiny bit of an asterisk there. For the most 99% of the time, it's not incrementally funded like NIH is. But these are all things we can discuss strategically when after we cross some of those initial hurdles that you asked about before.
All right, it seems like we don't have any more questions. As Eric said, we're gonna share the slides and the recording with you later this week. And you can reach out to conafe@ucdavis.edu if you're interested in having a conversation with Eric and his team, specifically about CDMRP, but also about any kind of opportunities within Department of Defense and the health and life sciences, biological sciences type research. If you don't know if your question fits within our agreement with Eric and his team, just send me an email and we'll figure it out. We are very flexible and we try to make sure you get all the help that you need. So with that, I'm going to give you back 2 minutes of your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you, Eric, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.